this stuff about entitlements and adding value, it doesn't speak to everybody within the land business. There's so many people that love the fact of just going in and buying and flipping recreational land, and they love it and they just want to scale that. And there's so nothing wrong with that. That's perfect. My thing is that I have all that experience and I just never wanted to like not use it.
How do I rezone that and sell that to somebody who wants to build an apartment or something?
Sure. So there's two scenarios, and so in general, rezoning is just changing that zoning designation. But in order to change that zoning designation, there's a process that you have to go through to do that. And basically, there's two scenarios to what you're describing. One would be is that
All right, everybody, welcome to the King Show. I've got Mike Marshall here with me. Mike is, I would say, my who, not how. And I'm actually going to let Mike introduce himself. I'm going to let him talk a little bit about what he does, what expertise he brings to the table, and maybe how, how he can help you. So if you're just jumping in, I'm going to hand things over to Mike, and I'm just going to say, hey, Mike, like for the listeners, what's your main thing, man? What do you do? What are you known for?
sure, yeah, I think within the land space, I'm probably most known for like the entitlements guy. The guy that works a lot with local jurisdictions on processing maybe subdivisions, rezoning applications, things like that. I'm probably a little bit different than most people in that I focus a lot on adding value. That's where I get like the equity spread. I don't so much focus on getting like the steep discount. I'm more focusing on getting myself and people I work with to really add value and create their equity that way. And so when I do that, that's really through entitlements. And so that's going to be, again, subdivisions, it's going to be rezoning, maybe some things that are called special use permits. There's a variety of different types of entitlements. And those are the things that we use to be able to add value. And so entitlements are basically the first step in the overall development process. And so when we think of development, I usually kind of describe it as like three buckets. One is this first phase, which is the entitlements phase. And then the second phase is maybe the engineering phase where you're moving dirt on the ground and getting subsurface utilities in. And then the third phase is what people think of when I'm thinking about development. That's the actual building permit phase. And so those are three buckets. And I've lived, my professional career and what I do now in that first bucket in this whole realm of entitlements.
So yeah, so that's a good, I think that's a good natural segue into like backstory, right? Like what's the backstory behind what you're currently doing? How did you get into entitlements, right? And then we'll kind of continue to kind of like demystify what is an entitlement throughout. But how did you get into? How'd you get started?
Yeah, I came out of college, or I was at my last semester of college, and I was realizing really quickly that I didn't want to do what I majored in, but I always had a
First,
real.
never, by the way, to realize that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Pre-college.
In order to realize that.
Yeah. So I was sitting there, thinking, okay, well, what do I want to do? And I had a little bit of experience in my family with real estate. My dad had owned some properties and stuff like that. So I had some introduction into it, but no, head start of any kind. And so I came out of college, but I needed a job. And so at the time I got a job with a local city, working within the profession that I was into school for, which was basically like recreation programming and things like that at the city level. I was doing all sorts of things like youth camps and outdoor adventure trips, all these things like this. But I needed a job. So I got that job with the city. But then I really actively started looking at, well, where can I work within the city that was real estate related? And that's how I got introduction into like this whole world of planning. And so it wasn't like directly like real estate, like buying and selling, but it certainly was, applicable. And so I just really worked my yeah, yeah, this is Southern California. So I'm just like northern Los Angeles County.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that does play a role in it because of how complex the development process is in California. It really was a good learning ground. So I was able to really like cut my teeth doing a lot of different types of projects. And so I worked for that local jurisdiction for probably a couple jurisdictions for about 17 years within the whole planning and zoning space. And so I was really working on the city side of the equation, but still processing and working on development projects, everything from like custom houses to 2,000 lot residential subdivisions, medical office buildings, commercial retail centers, all this kind of stuff, but all within the space of entitlements. But then I started to branch out and started to basically consult with local developers in cities outside of the city that I worked in. And then eventually I was just able to branch out and go out on my own. And that's how I made the transition. But I got into the land space just by like speaking, offering to speak at a live event, of one of these educators that are out there. I just offered to speak at a live event. And then it kind of just took off from there, where I just started networking with local people. And really, like, a lot of what I started doing was really working in the whole subdivision idea, and really started talking to people about, hey, here's the different types of subdivisions. There's these things called exempt subdivisions, minors, majors, and really started focusing on that, because that was the one area that I think a lot of land investors could relate to in terms of how we can actually add value. Understanding subdivisions was much more relatable than understanding like rezoning and different other kind of entitlements. And so that was kind of like the launching point.
Well, let's back up, and we'll revisit subdivisions, right? 'Cause it's my love language, right? It's one of my favorite plays in the playbook. But let's back up where you said, "Okay, I'm working for the city," right? I'm working for the city, and then I start consulting outside of the city, right? Because you kind of just glazed over that, but knowing like being an employee and having that itch, right? That entrepreneurial itch to like go, hey, I want to do either I want to do something else totally, or I want to do something in addition to the current W-2 or day job, right? There's a lot of thought that goes into that. There's a lot of consideration. What did that look like when you decided to start consulting? Where did you have to kind of go outside your area so that there wasn't a conflict of interest, or was there any concern that your employer would say, "Hey, Mike, what are you doing, man? Like, you got a job, you can't be consulting outside of that day job."
Yeah,
That look like?
Yeah, they certainly would not be in favor of me consulting for projects that were going through the city I was working in. So that was a hard line. I didn't even approach them about that. That was just a known issue. And so what I did though is that I just created relationships with developers over time. I'm working with, these developers on a variety of different projects over a long period of time. So being there 15, 16 years or more, you create these relationships. And so they had projects going on in other cities. And so those are the projects that I was consulting on. So I wasn't bound by, any obligation or anything contractually or anything within my employment agreement with the city that I was working in. If I was doing it outside of the city, I never knew anything that I was doing, but I wasn't hiding it from them. But it was just very clear too that I wasn't to be like, very loud about it. In other words, I'm not putting out a bunch of social media stuff and all this other things. So as long as I kind of kept it to my own networking, then I was okay. So I was able to build it in that sense. And again, it got to the point where I was so busy that, you had to kind of take your foot off of first to get to second. And I had to make that transition.
Yeah, and I think that's where where there's that period of overlap, right? Where you've got the day job, right? You're moonlighting, you're doing this outside thing, and you get to this point, at least I did, and I hear this from a lot of people, right? It's kind of like, where is the day job? One, is the day job costing me money, right? Could I be, it's starting to cost me money. But two, just like, yeah, like you said, like okay, I'm not being loud and proud, marching down the street, holding my flag, talking about the side hustle. But at the same time, you go, well, like, I'm also not offering it up, right? So that's kind of the idea, is that period of overlap, I think, is to build something that has enough legs that whether the employer says, hey, I'm not okay with this, you got to kill that side thing, or you got to make a decision, what that decision is, right? So that makes sense. You had relationships outside of the current market you were in, so it's kind of more acceptable to work those. And I think we're good now, right, Mike? Like, the statute of limitations is passed. Like, you can talk openly about this, right? They're not gonna hire that Jen or anything.
Yeah, they didn't want me to come back for 2 years, though. That was the thing. If I wanted to come back and do projects with developers in that city, I had to wait, like, 2 years to be able to do that. So it's a little bit of a non-compete kinda thing in a way. It was interesting, but it was fine, though, because I had projects that were, city of Los Angeles, all sorts of other places. But then also too, like I said, once I started getting into the land space more, what I started realizing was that I wasn't really, like, constrained by geography. I could do they true that the zoning and regulations are different in every jurisdiction. That is very, very true. However, if you've been in anything long enough, you see the parallels, you see the consistency between different concepts, and you know what questions to ask, and so it wasn't as hard as transition as it may seem. If you're going to a brand new, it's a lot harder to try to know multiple
And I
jurisdictions.
would think, just an assumption here, but I think also that going from Los Angeles County, right, to Montana or Idaho, right, it was probably like it wasn't like you're like, oh, I'm overwhelmed with this process. There was probably a little bit of, wow, this moves quicker, or there's less to the process. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's moves quicker is the case in many places, easier in terms of just like the requirements and the regulations. And so what was always interesting to me is that people that weren't as experienced as I was in the land space, they would see these regulations and they'd think that they're overly burdensome. And I understand, but I'm like, comparatively, this is easy. And so it's all relative. And but yeah, it is very true that, I'm living in Texas and I look at it and saying like, wow, like the regulations in at least in the unincorporated areas, the places that are not actual cities, that's super simple. But once you get into cities, it gets a little bit more complicated and everything. But yeah, it was a nice thing that I was able to take all that experience and apply it somewhere.
Yeah, that's just it. Because a lot of people, sometimes the occupation, the day job, right? You don't always have the ability to consult within the same industry outside of work, right? So for you to be able to not that just be like sunk time, to be able to transfer a lot of those skills into starting and launching your own consulting company, I think that's huge. And obviously there's not the learning curve of like starting, you didn't go buy a car wash, right? Like you're not starting a new thing, right? It was more like, all right, well, I might not have all the resources I had with the departments and the right and people, and now you're starting your own thing, but you get the process. It's just more now running your own business, right? Like all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's like if you want to think about like the challenges and all that, I think the thing was is that I was so entrenched in that space and had all that experience and expertise. And then coming out to start my own business, I think the one challenge was is realizing like, oh, wait a minute, I have to market this. I actually have to actually be out there and like letting people know that I exist. And so that was the impetus to being on podcasts and all the stuff that everybody does that's out there. There's a lot of lessons that you learn, over a couple of years or so. The first 2 to 3 years of being in business, especially full time, you learn a lot of lessons. And so I've learned a lot along the way in terms of like messaging and, who my message is appropriate for, who it's not appropriate for. Because the truth is that this stuff about entitlements and adding value, it doesn't speak to everybody within the land business. There's so many people that love the fact of just going in and buying and flipping recreational land and they love it and they just want to scale that. And there's so nothing wrong with that. That's perfect. My thing is just that I have all that experience and I just never wanted to like not use it.
Well, yeah, you saw the additional, like, value add. Hey, like, it's still okay to capture equity, right? Like, it's still okay to buy for retail, but guess what? In addition to that, there's forced appreciation or value add opportunity that people aren't tapping into, and that's where, like you said, for listeners, because not everybody listen to the show, we're covering a pretty broad spectrum, and really, honestly, we're just, like, very selfishly covering what I'm interested in, and that's, like, entrepreneurs, right? Investors, agents, athletes, authors. So we're covering a lot of areas. So not everybody listening to the podcast is a land flipper. That's just for us. That's like, that's what pays the bills, right? That's the main thing. But for those that aren't familiar with that, you became kind of aware of this industry of land flippers, right? These communities, these groups, these gurus, these educators, just like all these different communities that you put yourself in and you realize that, hey, like these versus like just advertising yourself. Here's what I do. You got yourself in rooms and in communities in front of people that are in the asset class that you work in, right? And you kind of are bringing awareness to them that like, hey, you guys are all land flippers. Here's what you do. You're going out there and you're marketing and you're trying to buy land at 50 cents on the dollar, for example, and then you're just flipping it. What you could be doing in addition to that is like subdividing it, which, forces appreciation or adds value just by splitting large acreage into the smaller lots. And that's kind of that's how we came to know each other is I heard you on a podcast and I had stumbled through just through like reverse engineering, right?
Yeah.
I identified an opportunity where my first property, I found a 40-acre parcel, and I'm kind of researching it, and the adjoining property next to me, I could see used to be a 40, and somehow this guy had subdivided it into a 20, a 10, and 2 fives. And I go, "Oh, well, that's cool." What I didn't understand, and this is a long time ago, but at the time, my main focus was creating lots of notes, or like right, just buying properties, selling them with seller financing to create, I'm not gonna call it passive income, but I'm gonna call it recurring revenue, right? Like recurring income through notes. So when I first saw, this 40-acre property, I would have just resold and originated one note. All of a sudden, I see the adjoining property, and I see this guy had subdivided it into 4 parcels, this one parent parcel into 4 parcels. What I saw was like, I could create 4 notes, like I can all of a sudden with one acquisition, I can create 4 times as many notes, which helps me keep building up that. So I got on the county recorder site. Like I said, hey, like, let's look at this guy's recorded documents. What surveys did he record? And then I could see the survey company that he had used, right? And I could kind of reverse engineer what had happened. And then I stumbled through some myself, like just ignorantly, just not even knowing there was land use consultants like you that I could say, "Hey, Mike, I'm gonna cut you a check for a nominal amount, right? Relative to the value added and the pain in the butt of stumbling through a process that's foreign to me."
Mhm.
I wasn't even aware there was people that did what you do. When I did, that's where I'm going, "Oh my goodness, this is fantastic." Instead of me either doing something wrong and having to reapply and go through the process, we could just hand it to you. You're working in your area of genius, right? We know we're doing everything right. And I can focus for me, I can then turn and focus on more marketing, more acquisitions, and you can focus on the subdivide piece.
Yeah.
So that's where I think a lot of people that are flip, 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 man, you're leaving money on the table, dude. You're leaving so much money on the table because what you do, the byproduct, or actually not byproduct, the you're going through this process, but the process you take people through adds value, forces appreciation. And that's something that most people are just playing the game of arbitrage and flip, flip,
Mhm.
flip, right? And that's where you come in and go, hey, for like a drop in the bucket consulting fee, we can add all this value, right? And subdivisions is you do a number of things. Maybe we'll kind of bullet point each one. You do a number of things, but one thing you do is and we've got three separate projects working on together right now, where one thing you do is you kind of go, you meet with the jurisdiction, you meet with the city, you meet with the county, you kind of read the temperature of the room and what we can and can't do, and then you break down the process and in a sense dumb it down for dirt flippers like me and say, hey, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do, here's how long it takes, right?
Right. Yeah, that is a big part of it, like, is utilizing my experience in those meetings. I mean, I've been in, I gotta say, probably a couple hundred of those type of meetings, over the years. And it's really important because you have to know what questions to ask and you have to know what follow-up questions to ask, and if you don't really know that, then you can get lost in a situation where you expect that the jurisdiction is going to tell you everything you need to know. But in my experience, that's often not the case. You really have to dig and get that information. And so that is a lot of what we do right now, is helping people with this pre-application due diligence. So everything that leads up to the actual application itself, we're doing a lot of that due diligence ourselves. And then we're actually meeting with the jurisdiction to fill in the gaps and confirm some things. And then if it's a green light, then we'll actually take it from the actual application phase all the way through the review and the approval process. And so that's a lot of what we're doing right now. And we're branching into some other things too. But that's a lot of what we're doing, especially for people in the land space. That's a lot of what we're doing. And again, it's not just subdivisions, it's also rezoning and some other things too.
Well, and kind of first things first, like if somebody has a property now, whether they want to subdivide it, whether they want to rezone it, they want to entitle it and source it right to a builder or something, it kind of am I right that it kind of starts with feasibility, where I go like, hey, Mike, here's what I'm thinking. Here's the parcel number. Here's the property. Like, is this feasible? Is that fair to say that it kind of starts with that?
Yeah, like the very, very first thing that we start with is, what jurisdiction are we in? Are we in an unincorporated county? Are we in an incorporated city? Where are we actually at? Because that ends up really informing us in terms of what rule book are we playing by. Every jurisdiction is going to have their own rule book, but I need to know what the rules are. Once I know what the rules are, then I'm pretty sure I can win, but I need to know what those rules are. And so first thing is really understanding what jurisdiction I'm in first. And then from there, it's a matter of looking at zoning, like, okay, is there zoning in this jurisdiction? Yes or no? If there is, then what are my allowable land uses? What can we do with the property essentially? And then we start looking at constraints too. That's typical stuff that most land, flippers are really looking at already. Things like, FEMA floodway type stuff or wetlands or other things like that, kind of the physical constraints. We'll get into that too. But a lot of what we specialize in is really the regulatory due diligence side of things, looking at, again, what the process looks like, what the obligations are going to be. Because when you get a project approved, there's something that's called conditions of approval. And those conditions of approval are going to obligate you to certain things once you get your project approved. And so a lot of what we do right now, and we're doing this for larger commercial stuff too, is really doing an audit of those conditions of approval to see if there's ways that we can save developers time, save them money on things like that. And so that's a big part of what we're doing right now. So we're utilizing all that experience over the years to really kind of leverage ourselves into a position to really help people that are either subdividing or even larger developers do their projects and get them on the ground.
Well, and so you're kind of starting out for people that aren't familiar, you're starting out with you go like, people hear jurisdiction, right? And they think you can think a cop show or something, right? Like, not your thing. But we're starting as kind of what Mike's saying a lot of times is you go, hey, we're marketing in an area. We have a property that has an opportunity to maybe subdivide ourselves or maybe rezone from single family to multifamily or maybe like entitle where like, hey, this would be a good property for a builder to, essentially put, 50, 200 lots on it. I'm not going to do that. I can't do that or don't can't do that or don't want to do that. But I want to get everything ready, right, for them and do all the legwork so that it's appealing to essentially source that property to them. But the first thing Mike's saying is you got to know like who's the jurisdiction? Are we talking at the county level or is this controlled at the city level? And once we know that, he knows who to direct questions to. Once he knows it's at the county level or at the city level, and then Mike can kind of start to break down like what's the process. And I'll tell you, when I talk about feasibility, like there might be situations where Mike reviews a property and he goes, hey, well, you can't do what you thought you could because the minimum lot size in this area is X. And you wanted to, we're just not able to do what you wanted to do because the minimum lot size. We had another one where you brought to my attention that we are subdividing in Pinell County, Arizona, where it's kind of a weird shaped property, a little bit of an hourglass with, if people could visualize like an hourglass with the bottom of the hourglass being a little skinnier. And I had said, hey, can't we just and there was road access on the north boundary and the southern boundary. I said, can't we just split this in the middle, this one parcel into two? And he said, oh no, Travis, we can't because the county, that was the jurisdiction, the county requires the minimum road frontage, to be this many feet or this many hundreds of feet. And that bottom part, the skinny part of the hourglass at the bottom doesn't meet that minimum road frontage. So that's probably why. And then when we then realized that's probably why this has always been kept whole when it looked like a pretty natural split horizontally, right? So there's these little nuances that people are unaware of and you make assumptions and you wouldn't, as an investor, you wouldn't want to buy that and assume you could subdivide and then find that out later. So that's where like feasibility, you look at things and you go like, is this feasible? And we'd rather pay a very small fee for that feasibility test than we would to buy the property outright and find that out later, right, ourselves.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes that I see people make very often is that they'll look at adjoining property and they'll say, "Oh, well, these over here have such and such lot size, and so I should be able to do the exact same thing on my property." And without getting into the weeds too much, there's a variety of reasons why that may not be. And so if you purchase the property based on that assumption, you may find yourself in a situation where you're not able to get as many lots as you thought you were. And so the valuation of everything changes. And now if you're going and buying 50 cents on the dollar, maybe you're protected to a certain degree because it allows you to make some mistakes sometimes. But ultimately, you don't want to make a habit of that. And so one of the biggest things I see is people making the mistake of just pointing next door saying, well, they were able to do that, so I shouldn't have to do as much due diligence on this piece, and I'll be able to move forward. And I think that's oftentimes a fatal error.
Yeah, and I think I'm a little guilty of that when I'm looking at a mapping level, like at a cursory level, I go, well, if they could do this, I probably can. So I'll mark it in that area with that assumption first, but then yeah, we'll call the county. We'll make sure we can do that if we actually get some yeses and some signed contracts, right? But that's more of like, hey, rather than read the 250-page subdivide ordinance, I'm gonna assume that if I don't do anything, and this is something you told me, like if I'm not doing anything more extreme than it's kind of already been done in the area, there's a good chance they'll be receptive to it. But again, yeah, we're verifying that, right? We're verifying that before we move forward to purchase. And a lot of times in value add, when we're buying cheap single parcels, you can pick things up for 40, 50 cents on the dollar. And for those that aren't land investors, land flippers, you might be skeptical about that, but there's thousands upon thousands of us that's our occupation, right? Is buying things at half price and flipping them. But when we get into the higher value properties, right? The much higher value properties, people aren't, regardless of what the gurus hawking courses are telling you, people are not lining up to sell their $300,000 property for 50 cents on the dollar. And if the play is value add, okay, there's a lot of times we've got to buy deeper, right? 70%, 75, maybe 80% of retail price. But we know that with that value add, that subdivide or whatever, we might be forcing 80% appreciation, maybe even 100% or doubling, right?
Yeah.
So we're okay with paying 70 or 80%, but you haven't insulated yourself from risk. You know what I mean? Because you're buying so much deep. You can't do what you thought you could. You've now bought a property for 80 cents on the dollar and you can't value add, right? So it's critical if you're buying deeper and buying closer to retail that you can do what you think you can. Otherwise, you end up with you spend a lot of acquisitions dollars
Yeah.
just kind of trying to bail on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the large part of what we were trying to do. I mean, when I first started speaking at that land event that I was telling you about, when I was kind of first getting into the land space, I came into it with the motivation really of like, I'm going to try to save people from making the mistakes that I saw people make for 15 plus years working for a jurisdiction where I saw people buy all sorts of property without being informed. I mean, and I was like shocked, like, wow, there's nobody in the mix really helping these people. And so I went into it with that in mind, was that I wanted to help people do the proper due diligence to understand what they were buying. And that way they're coming into it with a much more informed position. And we've been able to do that in a large part. And as the industry has grown over the last handful of years, then I think there's more resources for that type of due diligence. There's more awareness of it. So people are out there doing it, or they've built teams around themselves to be able to do that kind of stuff. So that's become better because when I was first getting into the land space, there was a lot of just people didn't know any better. They just didn't know. It was a new space, and people were learning and stuff and cutting their teeth. And that was I think that's probably 2018 that I did that. And then over the next, 6 years now, it's definitely gotten a lot better. There's a lot more resources, and there's a lot more wisdom and a lot more savvy within the land space too. It's just a maturing space.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's so many softwares right now coming out that allow you to look at things you couldn't before. That's kind of when people go, well, geez, like, it was easier when you got into it, or am I late to the party or this or that? And they go, well, yeah, there's more people doing it. Anybody who says there's not, right? Like it's not the secret it was a decade ago, but like there's also incredible tools, right now that weren't available back when like I was doing like working on Excel documents for, 10, 12 hours and doing mail merges to get a direct mail campaign out there, right? And didn't have software, going to the FEMA websites to look at floods. I mean, now we've got all these great softwares and web apps for us, at our disposal. But yes, more people are doing it. But at the same time, like, dude, it's never been easier from a software and tools perspective. And even like you, like consultants or people we can go to, right, as the industry's kind of matured. I feel like there's a lot more tools and consultants at people's, disposal for sure.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times what happens, or at least what happens now, is that I think specialization becomes really important too, and you can specialize in so many different ways. I mean, you could be like this entitlement specialist like I'm talking about, or you could be, I do minor land divisions in such and such county, and that's my specialization. So I think it becomes important to be that person. You have to kind of create an identity for yourself within the space. So you kind of become a little bit known as that go-to person to a certain degree regarding whatever it is your specialty, instead of being able to kind of, pray and spray kind of thing. And I think that
Yeah.
originally, early on, people were able to do that. There's a lot more forgiveness, but because there are more people in there, you just have to find a way to distinguish yourself from the rest and whatever that happens to be. And if you have previous experience that is applicable, then I think you need to lean into it, whether it's like from an accounting background or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
Whatever you can do to lean into that and use that as your leverage point, that's something else to consider too.
Well, and you touched on so rezoning. Let's talk about rezoning for a minute. Like, what is that? What is that for people that aren't familiar? And then why would you do that? Like, why would that be the strategy?
Sure. So to understand rezoning, you have to understand zoning at its core ultimately too. And so when a property is zoned, it's, assigned some sort of designation. And that designation is going to relate to how the property can be used. And so that's literally how the land use, how the property is used, but then also what it looks like in terms of like architecture, landscaping, how much of a building area can go on a certain property. There's a myriad of different development standards that really dictate how a property ends up looking at the end of the day. But all that's predicated on the zone that it's in. And so the one that most people are going to be most common, aware of is like an R1 zone, which is just be your standard single family zone. But the unfortunate part is that not every jurisdiction has the same zoning designations, and even jurisdictions that have R1, if you have two jurisdictions that have an R1 zone, those R1 zones are not going to be exactly alike. So every jurisdiction has its own zoning designation with its own rules, regulations, development standards that are attached to it that dictate how a property can be used. And so that's zoning in of itself. Yeah.
Rezoning, that's where I go, okay, I go like, what is it currently zoned? All right, now I'm familiar with that. Now, what if I see there's like a eightplex next door, right? Why is mine zoned like single family, right? Or R1, or like you're saying, like, how do I rezone that and sell that to somebody who wants to build an apartment or something?
Sure. So there's two scenarios, and so in general, rezoning is just changing that zoning designation. But in order to change that zoning designation, there's a process that you have to go through to do that. And basically, there's two scenarios to what you're describing. One would be is that I have a single family house, and then right next to me there's an eightplex. And so there's one of two things that are going on there. One is that the property that has a single family property on it, it's zoned for an eightplex today as it is. It's just an underutilized property. So in that situation, you don't have to change the zoning. You just have to go through a development review process to actually get that property approved for the eightplex. So that's a much easier situation because you're not changing the zoning. The alternative is that the property next door is zoned for an eightplex, but you're still zoned for a single family house. And so by the rules that are existing on the property today, that's all you can do. But now what you're talking about with the rezoning is you're saying, I want to change those rules. And so I want to change those rules to go from R1 to R4 or whatever it happens to be that allows for the eightplex building. So you have a process that you have to go through, and that process ultimately ends up at the planning commission and then the city council or their equivalent. It's a legislative act. It needs to be done by the city council or the board of supervisors. They take final action on it. But once they approve it, then you're all dialed in. And so the thing is that the reason why it adds value though is because the value of land is tied to its use. Yeah, many, many ways.
Bold font underscore that. Yeah.
Yeah, that is like the biggest key to takeaway in the whole notion of rezoning is that value is attached to use. And so if I change the use, then I change the value and it can go up or down. And so most common is people talk about in terms of upzoning. So I want to go from a single family to an eightplex. That's an upzoning. The example of down zoning would be going from the eightplex zoning down to R1 for single family. And there are occurrences and reasons why that's applicable and why it's useful. But majority of the time, you're looking about upzoning the property. And so you change the use, you change the potential of the site. And by changing the potential of the site, the value goes up. And I can give you an example of that is that one property that we were working on, ultimately what we did is we had an appraiser go in and say, okay, this is agriculturally zoned land. We're going to appraise it as is today. But surrounding the property, there was single family, there was a park across the street, there was other uses that were more intense. And so if we were to go and change the zoning to a multifamily zoning, what's that going to look like in terms of value? And in that situation, ultimately, by doing that, having the appraiser looking at as is, as ag zone, versus a hypothetical rezoning over to multifamily, which we're able to do, it was a seven-figure value add just in that shift. Like, the only thing that was done was paper. There was nothing done to the physical property at all.
That's the main thing to understand there, right? For people is that, yeah, you can have sweat equity. You could put roads in, you could do these things, but the beauty of what you're doing or helping people do, right, is that upzone, that rezone. You're adding value by just going through that process so that others don't have to, right? Either they're currently these builders are just looking at properties they're already zoned that, right? Or you're saving them that time of converting it essentially to the zoning they want it. That's their on-ramp. They want it zoned at that, right? So if you go through that process with that value add, you get to harvest that equity and that value add of what you rezone. We've got, and that's true, like we talked about single family, upzoning from single family to multifamily. The agricultural, like the ones we're working on together right now in Montana, currently zoned agricultural, right? Our intended use is residential for those, right? Which the value per acre is significantly higher in a residential, right, property
Yeah.
than an agricultural property. That's why, like, we've got one it's kind of stalled out. I think we're a couple months out on it. The 85 acre we're working together on, and that one, if we can get some siblings to agree on some things, that one the situation with that is, it's agricultural, so here's an example to people. I think it's probably market value is probably 650. We're getting it for 450. The appraised value is 17,000. And I highlight that just because, like, its current use is agricultural. So they're appraising it and assessing it for agricultural use, $17,000, right? Which is crazy because that has no correlation, nothing to do with the actual value, which is probably 450 to 650, right? So as we switch it from agriculture, now we're going to have higher property taxes, right? Once it becomes residential, but it's worth significantly more. So yeah, rezoning is, yeah, it's, I don't know, dude, it's alchemy, right? All of this, honestly, what you do, like, you're kind of an alchemist, like, of every, like subdividing, rezoning, all of that is the closest thing to alchemy or printing money I think there is, with having, like, painted houses and put new roofs on and flooring in an effort to, like, get sweat equity.
Yeah.
Like, the stuff's beautiful.
Yeah.
Mike,
Go ahead.
let me get into kind of share. So if somebody wants to reach out with you or work with you, what services do you offer? What do you do?
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Basically what we're doing right now for people in the land space is really, again, helping them through that entitlement process, but it starts early with the due diligence. So we can do like due diligence reports, which ultimately is part of that discussion regarding us meeting with the jurisdiction themselves. So as part of that due diligence process, we're meeting with the jurisdiction, we're finding all the opportunities, we're finding the constraints, we're compiling it into a meaningful report for you, and then we're able to offer that to you as part of like this pre-application phase. The second thing that we're doing is really helping you through the entitlement process itself. And so that's, again, starting with the application, running through the approval at the planning commission and or city council for that subdivision or rezone, what have you. And so that's a lot of what we're doing right now for people in the land space. We're doing other stuff in the commercial world, right now, commercial development world. But for as far as like land space, that's what we're working on right now.
Excellent. And your company, I see TPG in the back. Why don't you tell everybody who your company is and give some context?
Sure. Yeah. It's Tolosa, Tolosa. So it's Tulosa Property Group. And The background to the name is just basically there is a winery in California where we used to live. That was our favorite winery, is the Tulosa Winery, and so we kind of took that name and applied it to what we do. And then we moved to Texas, and then ironically, about so we not only had that winery, but there was a little town about a half hour away from here that's called Tolosa, which is ironic. And so, but anyway, yeah, it came from the winery was where it came from and stuff, and so it stuck with us and kept with it. So yeah, so you can go to our website, TolosaPropertyGroup.com, and it has everything regarding what we offer. If you are thinking of something that you're not seeing on there, you can certainly reach out to us, and I'll see how I can help you out.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, we use Mike. My one-on-one coaching students more and more are starting to use Mike for these type of projects. Okay, and the nice thing with what Mike does is sometimes it's like he doesn't just send you a big invoice, okay, for everything. It's kind of like, hey, here's the feasibility, right? If it's feasible, right, we'll pay for that, and it's feasible, we'll move forward. And then there's kind of phase one, phase two, right, where we're kind of paying as we go as we move along the milestones, because sometimes you don't get a project to go all the way through, right? And sometimes things aren't feasible, and rather than Mike, tell you they are in charge of for everything, and then it not go through, he kind of has a phased approach, right? Which we can appreciate on our end, and I would say it's just one, it's an incredible time saver. It's just like, even if you know how to do this stuff, like, should you be doing it yourself? And the other thing is, like, this is your area of genius. This is what you do. So, the potential to make mistakes that cost time or money, I just feel like what I'm really good at is acquisitions, right? I should be focusing on acquisitions and move on to the next acquisition, right? Well, in parallel, you can be working a subdivide project or something for us, right?
Right.
And I can focus on mapping. So, in my opinion, what you're doing allows me to to continue to focus on what I enjoy doing, what I'm good at versus what I can stumble through, right? To save a couple thousand, right? So yeah, absolutely. If anybody's like stumbling through subdivides themselves or want to get into subdivides or rezoning, but they kind of, daunting, and they're like, man, I can't do this alone, and I don't want to try to do this. Well, you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. Hire guys like Mike. That's what they're there for. And we've had projects where we paid Mike, 10, 12 grand, and we added $120,000 like value, right? You know what I mean? So that's just like understanding that ROI of working with somebody that can help you with that value add. Sweet, Mike. Well, so I will, before we wrap things up here, I will tell people, yeah, you can go to Mike's website, but also on the episode webpage, we're going to link to everything too. So I know like a lot of people are listening to this on audio, you're driving your car, your truck, but like check out the actual webpage. We'll always have like all of the links to these guests, right? So you're not trying to whip out your phone and look it up while you're driving. Later, you can check out our webpage, and we're going to link to Mike and anything. We're also going to have key takeaways, and there were some good ones in here. Some takeaways, some nuggets from our conversation on the episode webpage, and definitely you can reach directly out to Mike. We kind of put our stamp of approval with Mike on there. We've worked with them, currently working on a couple projects. So whether you're doing entitlements, rezoning, or subdividing, yeah, Mike Marshall is your guy with Tulosa Property Group. Hey, Mike, any big takeaways or anything I missed before we wrap things up?
I don't think so. I think we hit on a lot of it. I think the big message is that, there's multiple different ways to profit, in real estate and especially in land as well. And so not any one of them is right or wrong per se, but I just wouldn't ignore the opportunity to add value. And I think that as this space matures, that's going to be more important for people to specialize, and finding ways to do that through entitlements is certainly one of those ways to do it. So I'd encourage anybody to really take a serious look at it.
All right. Hey, thanks, Mike. Appreciate you, man. I appreciate all you do for us, and I appreciate what you're doing for the industry. You're filling a huge gap for sure.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into The King Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Also, don't forget to head over to travisking.com for show notes, resources, bonus content, and more ways to connect with me and the guests that you hear on the show. Remember, greatness is already within you. It's time for you to boss up and claim it. Stop building someone else's empire and start building your own.